friends, welcome to Beautifully Bookish Bethany, where I have new videos every week about books and the geeky mom lifestyle. Today's video is perhaps my favorite video that I do every year, and that is my yearly reading stats extravaganza. I'm so excited to be finally filming this video. It's taken some prep work. I did a lot of looking at my reading spreadsheet for the year, comparing to some of my stats from previous years for a couple of these categories, and I literally have 3 pages of notes in a notebook for all the stuff that I want to cover in this video today. So I'm very excited to dive in. Let me just stay up front. I know this is not everybody's cup of tea. Like, some of you don't care about this deep dive into statistics and into all of the details of what I read and where they came from and all of this stuff. If this is not your thing, that's totally fine. I love it. I really enjoy watching other people talk about their statistics, and I like geeking out with my spreadsheet. If you are wondering what spreadsheet I use, I will link it in the video description down below. I use Brock Roberts' spreadsheet and then make a few modifications for the way that I like to do it. So I track a lot of information about the books that I read every year, which allows me to do this, and it's kind of fun. At the end of the video, I also have a few takeaways of things that I learned or noticed from looking at my statistics and action plans moving forward for addressing the few things that stood out to me that I want to make changes with. With that said, let's go ahead and dive right in. There's a lot to talk about, so let's do it. First up, if you're following my channel, you probably already know how many books I read this year. I read a total of 370 books in 2020, which is more books than I've ever read before by far. I think last year I read like 303 books, and that had been the most I'd ever read, so it significantly increased this year. The total page count is 127,305, which means I was reading books with an average of 344 pages. So I'm not just reading a ton of super short books either, although there are some in here, but I'm reading lengthier books. The average is 344, which is interesting. We're going to take a look at how many books I read each month, and what's cool about this is I now have 5 years of data to look back on, so you can really see how my reading has ramped up since the year that I started BookTube. I started my BookTube channel in June of 2017, and I had my second son in December of 2016. So what you're going to see here is I read basically nothing when he was a newborn and then slowly started getting back into reading, and you can really see these numbers ramp up. But first, let's look at my monthly counts for 2020, and then we can look at the comparison data. So here is how many books I read each month in 2020. My highest reading month was January, where I read 36 books, and my lowest reading month was April, where I read 21 books. My average for the year was 30.8, so almost 31 books a month. That was the average number of books I was reading every single month in 2020, which seems about right. I was averaging close to a book a day, total finished across months. But that number is definitely higher than it has been in previous years. The other thing that is interesting to look at this is not just total number read, but also number of pages read. If we look at that number, my highest reading month in terms of pages read was actually July, when I read 33 books, but some of those had much higher page counts. That was followed by January and then August in terms of highest page count read, which shouldn't be surprising given that January was my most books read. My lowest page count was the same as my lowest book number, which is April. I don't find that super surprising. April, we were deep in COVID territory, and I was planning for the Social Distance Book Fest, which was taking up a ton of my time. So honestly, the fact that I still read 21 books that month is like pretty impressive. I think most of that was audiobooks that month. And then my second lowest in terms of page count was May, when I read 27 books, but maybe some shorter works. Now let's compare it to the 3 years previous. What's interesting about this is the year that I started my BookTube channel, keeping in mind, as you can see, that I read almost nothing for the first half of that year, my average books per month was 5.4. So even in a year where I was not reading very much, that was still my average. In 2018, my average per month was 24.9, so you saw a really big jump in my reading that year. The year after that was 25.3, and then 2020 was like an even bigger jump. Part of this might be that halfway through 2019, I think, is when I started listening to audiobooks, and so that kind of bumped my numbers higher from what they had been. But I just think the comparison here is really interesting, that back in 2017, I had 2 months where I didn't read anything at all. Of course, I also had a newborn, so like, that's fine. And then October that year was my highest reading month with 15. And I remember thinking 15 books in a month was so much to read. Like, little did I know that it was just going to keep growing from there. Anyway, I just think this is interesting to look at the change over time. Next, I want to take a look at my average ratings per month, and basically what I did is I did my raw ratings with my 6-star scale, and then I adjusted them for if I was just doing 5 stars instead of 6 stars, because that's like averages it up, and it makes a slight difference. So in general, I had a really great reading year in terms of quality. My average rating for the year according to Goodreads is 3.9, which would be the adjusted rating according to my spreadsheet. Whereas according to my spreadsheet, my average, if I don't adjust it, was 4.1. So giving an average of 4 stars to the books I read means I was mostly reading things I was really enjoying, which I think makes sense given the fact that I was DNFing a lot of stuff that I just didn't care that much about, and I didn't give out that many super low ratings this year. I just wouldn't read stuff I wasn't enjoying. The 2 months where I had the worst reading experience and had the lowest average ratings were May and November. Those adjusted averages are 3.6, and that's quite a bit lower than any other months in the year, whereas my highest average ratings were in December at 4.3, which is very high. I think a lot of this is the fact that, as you saw, I was doing a lot of mood reading, and I was really just focusing on reading things that I was excited about and things I was enjoying, and you see that reflected in the average rating. In terms of the distribution of those star ratings, let's take a look at this. I told you I didn't rate very many things super low, and this is true. In 2020, I gave 2 books 1 star, full stop, only 2, and I gave 5 books 1.5 stars. So only 7 books total got in that 1-star range. It's not a rating that I give out very frequently, and often I would probably just DNF a book if I was disliking it that much. I did give 11 books 2 stars, 21 books 2.5 stars, so I think my most frequent low rating that I give is 2.5 stars, which is like, it has redeeming qualities, but I didn't like it all that much. That generally is what things will end up getting. 51 books got 3 stars, 30 books got 3.5 stars, and then my most frequent rating, which again, given my averages, probably shouldn't come as a surprise, is 4 stars. 85 of the books that I read this year got 4 stars, and that was my most frequently given star rating. Then I gave out 58 4.5 stars, 78 got 5 stars, and 29 of the books that I read got 6 stars. And in my personal rating scale, 6 stars is what I give to differentiate for a book that I'm considering a favorite of the year or favorite of all time. 29 of the books that I read got that, which is a little less than 8% of the books that I read total. So I'm pretty happy with that makeup. Okay, next let's look at publication date range, and I'll put up a nice graph for you to look at for this. I thought this was pretty interesting, although unsurprisingly, by far, the most books that I read this year were 2020 releases. And that's not surprising in a year where I was reading a lot of books for review. I was reading a lot of front list. 214 of the books that I read were published in 2020, which means that a whopping 58% of the books that I read in 2020 were 2020 releases. Like, I mean, that's not surprising. I think moving into 2021, I would like to see that number drop a little bit. I'd probably like to have it closer to 50%. I'm fine with having about half of my reading be frontlist titles, because I think a lot of what I'm doing is reviewing new and upcoming releases for you guys so you know what to think about them. But I do think it was a little bit more than I wanted it to be this year, and I'd like to, you know, shift my focus somewhat to reading more backlist. 4 of the books that I read this year were 2021 releases. I read a few at the end of the year, but I generally like to try not to read too many of the following year before the next year, if that makes sense. 49 of the books that I read were published in 2019. 96 of the books that I read were published between 1900 and 2019. So it's in that kind of range. And then I read 2 books that were published pre-1900. The earliest published work that I read this year was Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, which came out in 1811. This is another thing I'm hoping to see change a little bit moving into 2021. I would like to read a few more books that are pre-1900 or earlier in the 1900s than I did last year. So, yeah. Page 2 of 3. I told you I have 3 pages of notes to talk about. This is your deep dive, guys. I do my monthly stats. We do even more at the end of the year. In terms of books that I had for review, this makes sense also given the makeup of how much front list I was reading. In 2020, 205 of the books that I read were books for review. Most of those were 2020 releases. Some of them were earlier releases that I hadn't gotten to. I had some earlier arcs that I finally got around to reading. In total, 55% of the books that I read were books for review. The rest of them were books that I just picked up because they were what I wanted to read or books that I already had on my bookshelves. Looking at genre, this was interesting, but given my monthly stats, not super surprising. My most read genre, and this won't show up as much on the chart that I'm going to show you, and I'll explain why, but overall my most read genre was romance. 141 of the books that I read were in the romance category, which is 38% of my total reading. The chart that you see divides that up into subgenres, which is why it doesn't look like it's taking up as big of a chunk. 65 of those books were contemporary romance, 45 of them were historical romance, and 31 of them were speculative romance. But yeah, almost 40% of my reading was romance this year. Although I will say the 31 speculative romance are books that are either fantasy romance or sci-fi romance. So there is some crossover into other genres, but for this year, I'm putting those all in the romance category. Unsurprisingly, my next highest genre was fantasy at 90 books. So almost a quarter of my reading this year was fantasy. I also read 18 contemporary fiction, 6 historical fiction, 26 horror, and I think that it has become kind of a new favorite genre this year. I've really found my niche in horror and what it is that I enjoy there. My lowest read genre this year was literary fiction with 5 books, and I am okay with that. I read 7 mysteries, 21 nonfiction, which is a great number. I'm very happy with that nonfiction number. 6 poetry, although a lot of those were novels in verse. A couple were not, but most of them were. 39 sci-fi, and 11 thrillers. One thing that I was curious about is if I looked at my favorite genres, which I would say are romance, science fiction, fantasy, and horror, what percentage of my reading was covered just by those genres? And the answer is 80%. So a whopping 80% of my reading was in my most favorite genres. The other 20% of my reading was taken up with other genres that I like to pull from. I'm okay with that. It might be a little bit on the high end, but I also think this is why my ratings have continued to stay high, is a lot of it is I'm leaning into what am I enjoying, what am I wanting to read, what am I wanting to pick up, and you know, that's kind of great. That's really what I want to be doing. Best case scenario, I'm reading a lot of books that I'm loving. Okay, then looking at the age categories, this was interesting and I think demonstrates the biggest shift this year from previous years. Last year I was close to 50-50 between adult and YA with something like 8% middle grade. This year I read a lot less middle grade and significantly less YA. I read a lot more adult books, and I think I'm really focusing in on the specific YA titles that I want to be reading in specific genres. I'm getting a lot more picky, not that I don't still love some YA, but I'm just getting a lot pickier about what it is that I'm picking up for that age category. So this year, 251 of the books that I read were targeted at an adult audience. That is 68%. That is a significant increase. I think last year it was closer to 45% of my reading. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but it was somewhere in that range of like 45 to 50% of my reading was targeted at an adult audience. And this year that jumped all the way up to almost 70%. Again, not super surprising if you've been watching my wrap-ups every month with my statistics, but I don't know that I realized how dramatic it was. 109 of the books that I read were YA, which is almost 30% of my reading, and then this year I only read 11 middle grade novels, which is 3%. That was very low this year. I anticipate seeing that percentage go up quite a bit for 2021 because I have a couple of series that I'm planning on reading that are middle grade, but in general, it's just not my preferred age category and I'm very picky about it, and I'm okay with that. Looking at the format of the books that I was reading and the format of the books I was reading for review, unsurprisingly, I did listen to a lot of audiobooks this year. 177 of the books that I read were via audio or partly audio. Sometimes I would listen to the audio and sometimes read along physically, but 48% of my reading this year was via audiobook. 89 of them were ebooks and 105 of them were physical books. Getting a little bit more granular, looking at that, 77 of those ebooks were e-arcs, so books for review, which isn't surprising. Most of the time, the books that I'm reading on my e-reader are books for review, with the exception of sometimes I'll throw in a ebook romance. So only 12 of the ebooks I read this year were books that I purchased on my own and read. This year I also read 36 physical arcs. So a lot of the physical books that I'm reading are books that are either from my TBR shelves or books that I purchased to read. Only 36 of them were physical arcs. Again, part of this is they were sending out less physical arcs because of COVID, and that's part of why that number is different. The year before, I definitely did not read as many ebooks just in general. That number has gone up. And looking at my audiobooks, 38 of the audiobooks I listened to were audio arcs, so books that I got for review. This also does include influencer review copies from Libro FM. So the places I'm getting audio arcs are NetGalley, the Penguin Random House Volumes app, and Libro FM. That's where those 38 are coming from. And then 32 of the audiobooks I listened to are audio arc shelf. So these are where I had a physical arc, but I listened to the audiobook. Sometimes this is backlist titles where maybe I had a physical arc sitting on my TBR for a while and hadn't gotten around to it and was like, okay, let me just get the audiobook from my library and listen to it that way. So 32 of the audiobooks were that. This year, only 11 of the books that I read were rereads, books that I had read previously, which that's also a number I would like to see go up at least a little bit, maybe not a ton. I'm okay with mostly reading new books, but I would like to do a little bit more rereading going into 2021. And only 5 of the books that I read were translated. That's only 1% of my reading was translated. That is another number I would like to see increase. In 2019, I had made it a goal to read 1 translated book a month, and I achieved that goal and was like, okay, great. I'm not going to make that a goal moving forward. I just generally would like to kind of keep it up. But I think what this shows me is that when I don't make it an intentional thing of putting translated fiction on my TBRs, I don't read as much. So that is something that I want to work on as well. I'm really pleased with the number of indie books that I'm reading. This year, 42 of the books that I read were indie or self-published, which is 11% of my reading. I'm very happy with that number. I probably want to see that at around the 10% mark. That's great. Last thing on this page, and then we're going to move into my diversity statistics and most read authors. The last thing I want to look at kind of goes with the indie published thing, is who was publishing most of the books that I was reading. I thought this was interesting. My spreadsheet tracks the publisher. So my most read publisher, and honestly, not surprised considering they're sort of the juggernaut of the big 5. 107 of the books that I read this year were published in some way by Penguin Random House. Note that this does include some of the companies that they've purchased and some of their sub-imprints. So Penguin Random House is also including Source Books, because they own Source Books. It includes Berkeley, so like Berkeley Romance, and Quirk Books. So all of that is gathered in there. With the thing you'll see on the screen divides it out a little bit more, but I wanted to look a little more high level at kind of how many of the books that I'm reading are coming from what we call the big 5 publishers, and I thought that was interesting. So 107 were from Penguin Random House. 16 of the books that I read were from Simon & Schuster. 73 of the books that I read were from HarperCollins, and part of this is that HarperCollins includes Avon Romance and Harlequin Romance, so I read pretty significant number from them. 63 of the books that I read were from Macmillan, which I was actually surprised that that number wasn't higher. Macmillan includes Tor and Tor.com, who I love, and I do read quite a bit of them, but that's still a reasonably high number. I read 21 books published by Hachette, and they own the Orbit imprint, so I read quite a bit of science fiction and fantasy from Orbit. And then this year I only read 2 books by Scholastic, so those are what we call the Big Five, although with the merger it could be the Big Four. We'll see what happens with that this year. So in 2020, about 76% of my reading was books published by the Big Five publishers. 11% of it was, as I said, by indie or self-published authors, which means about 13% of my reading was from smaller presses. So I thought that was interesting. All right, moving on to page number 3, the last page of my notes to talk about today. And a lot of this has to do with the diversity of what I was reading and who were some of my most read authors, as well as how many debuts did I read this year. I felt like I was reading a lot of debut novels in 2020, and that is true. I went through and counted, and I'm going to do a better job of tracking. We're going to get into this with more of my diversity statistics. There are some things that I think my current spreadsheet, the way I had my spreadsheet set up for 2020, didn't allow me to track some things in as granular a way as I would like, and so I've made a few changes to the way that I'm tracking some of those elements moving into 2021. But looking at the debuts, in 2020 I read 88 debuts, which is 24% of my reading. That is a lot of debuts. I will say not all of those are 2020 debuts. Some of those are authors who published debuts in earlier years that I just happened to read in 2020, but I was feeling like I was reading a lot of new authors, and I think this shows that that was accurate. Then looking at the gender of the authors that I was reading, this is not surprising to me. I feel like every year I read primarily female authors, and 2020 was no different. In 2020, 53 of the books that I read were by male authors, which is 14%. 298 of the books that I read were by female authors, which is 81%. And then 7 books were by non-binary authors, which is 2% of my reading. And 12 of the books that I read were by both male and female authors or by groups of authors together, which is about 3% of my reading. I think the non-binary number is slightly up from last year in terms of percentage, which is great. I would like to continue to see that go up. Going into 2021, I'm also going to start tracking whether I am reading from trans authors. I know I did read from several trans women and some trans men in 2020, but I didn't track that on the spreadsheet, so I'm going to start tracking that so I can kind of keep an eye on that as well. Okay, so then talking about diversity, there are many things that I think are included in the term diversity, and I want to do a better job of tracking those more specifically than I did this year. There were 2 things that I did track pretty specifically. I tracked whether the author was queer or part of the LGBTQIA+ community, and I tracked the race and ethnicity of the author. I also did track the country that the author is living in. And then I had kind of a catch-all thing where I could say, you know, in the book, are there representations where it could be like, where do you have like a disabled character or a neurodivergent character or author or a combination? The problem is that most often I would just say combination because it would be multiple kinds of intersectional diversity, and so I can't really tell you the specifics. We're going to be changing that moving into 2021, but I can tell you that 104 of the books that I read did not have any kind of diversity in them at all, or what I was considering those different elements of diversity, which is 28% of my reading, which means that 72% of the books that I read had some kind of diversity to them, whether it was the race and ethnicity of the author or of the main characters, whether it was disabled characters or neurodivergent characters or characters with chronic illness or queer characters or queer authors. 72% of the books that I read had one of those things in them, which I think is pretty great, actually. 88 of the books that I read were by queer authors, authors who in some way identify as LGBTQIA+, and that is 24% of the books that I read, which I think is great. I'm really happy with that number. I would like to continue to see about a quarter of the books that I'm reading be from authors who in some way identify as queer. Then looking at race and ethnicity, I am fairly happy with this. I would like to see these numbers shift a little bit, but I think they are quite a bit better than they had been in previous years. In 2020, 55% of the books that I read were written by Caucasian authors. I would like to see that number a little bit lower. I'd like to see it like 50% or in the 40s, but 55% is still not terrible. My next highest category here is I read 75 books by Black authors, which is 20% of my reading. I think I do a really good job of picking up books by Black authors. A lot of my favorite authors across different genres are Black, and that's generally something I think I'm pretty good about. But as we see, there are other backgrounds that I'm not as great about picking up, and it's something that I want to work on going into the next year. About 7% of the books that I read this year were written by East Asian authors. About 7% were written by Latinx authors. 6% of the books that I read were written by South Asian authors. 2% of the books that I read were written by multiracial authors. So some of the authors I was reading from I identify as, say, Black and Indigenous or Black and Latinx, and so I'm putting them in this multiracial category. Another 2% of the books that I read were written by multiracial teams. Often these are anthologies that I'm reading, or books written by more than one person in some other way, where one or more of the authors are not Caucasian. And then the two places where I did not do super well this year are with reading from Indigenous authors and Middle Eastern authors. In both cases, only 0.08% of my reading was by Indigenous or Middle Eastern authors. I read 3 books by Indigenous authors and 3 books by Middle Eastern authors. So that is something that I really want to work on going into 2021. I already have some plans in place for how to start reading more books by Indigenous authors. I have some plans you're going to see coming for what that partly is going to look like this year, but I think this is helpful because I could definitely see places where I was a little bit weaker. I think I do a really good job of picking up books by Black authors, a reasonably good job of picking up books by Latinx and Asian authors, but the places that I really need to improve are Middle Eastern authors and Indigenous authors, particularly Indigenous authors, because throughout my reading history, I've not read many books by Indigenous authors, and that is something that I'm actively working on this year. All right, the last thing we're going to look at in terms of diversity is the countries that I was reading from. It's something I've had in the back of my mind to try to be better about picking up more books from authors who are not from the United States, and I think I did a decent job of that in 2020. I at least did more of it in 2020 than I've done in previous years, although it's definitely something I could improve on. And one other thing that I decided to track this year is authors who are immigrants from other countries. So there's quite a few people who maybe live in the United States or live in Canada or live in the UK, but they were not born there. And so I'm only tracking first-generation immigrants, but that is something I decided to track this year, which I thought was interesting. At a high-level view, I read from 16 different countries in 2020, which is significantly better than last year for sure, even if it does lean heavily on Western countries. Then I'll go through these more specifically in alphabetical order. I read 5 books from Australian authors. 1 was from a Belgian author. 12 were from Canadian authors. 1 was an author from the Dominican Republic. 1 was an author from Egypt. 19 of the authors I read from were first-generation immigrants. I read 1 book from an Indonesian author, 1 from a Japanese author, 4 books from an author living in Martinique, 13 books from an author living in New Zealand, and I can tell you right now, the majority of those are from one author, which we will get to shortly. Then I read 1 book from a Nigerian author, 1 book from an author from Oman, 1 book from a Portuguese author, 2 books from South African authors, 2 books from Swedish authors, 27 books from UK authors, so 7% of my reading was by UK authors, and then probably unsurprisingly, 277 of the books that I read were from American authors, which means 75% of my reading was American authors. Again, while I think I did do a better job in 2020 than in previous years, that's still a higher percentage than I would like to see moving forward. So that's something I want to be aware of and try to see that increase the diversity of where I'm reading from. All right, that said, the last thing we're going to talk about today is my most read authors of 2020. I think this is really interesting, not just to look at the one-offs, but also to look at who are the authors that I'm reading multiple books from and who are my most read authors for the year. So we are going to look at all of the authors that I read 3 or more books from in 2020. And we will start with 3 books and move to my most read author for the year. In 2020, I read 3 books from 8 different authors, which is quite a lot. So I was doing a lot of reading multiple books from the same author. I read 3 books by Tessa Dare, who I really love for historical romances that are funny. I read 3 books by Sabaa Tahir. This was me rereading the first 2 books in her Ember in the Ashes series and then reading A Reaper at the Gates. I read 3 books by Sebastian de Castell. That was reading parts of his Spellslinger series. I read 3 books by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. I'm almost caught up on her backlist. I have a couple more books to read, but I really, really love her writing. I read 3 books by Julia London. She's another historical romance author. I read 3 books by Riley Sager. A lot of this is me trying to catch up on his books because I have not read any of them, and I have 1 of his backlist titles left to read. I read 3 books by Robin Carr, who is a contemporary romance author. I think what you'll see is frequently the people I'm reading multiple books from are romance authors, partly because they release books pretty frequently throughout the year, and also just because I've been reading so much romance this year. And then lastly, I also read 3 books by S.A. Hunt. S.A. Hunt is a trans woman horror author, and I read all 3 books in her horror trilogy this year. Then there were 2 authors that I read 4 books from. The first one is Rebecca Weatherspoon, who is a self-published Black romance author. She writes a lot of diverse romance with great representation. I read 4 books or novellas in some cases from her. I also read 4 books by Adriana Herrera, who is a Afro-Latinx romance author. We're seeing a theme here. I've really been enjoying reading diverse romance. Then there were 2 authors that I read 5 books from this year. One of them is Alyssa Cole. This should not come as really a surprise. I love Alyssa Cole. She is one of my favorite authors, period. One of the books from her this year was more of a horror thriller. The others were romances. I was catching up on some of her historical novellas this year, which was fun. And then I also read 5 books by Stephanie Meyer for my Twilight project. Twilight project. I did not necessarily like any of those books, but I reread the entire Twilight series and then also read Midnight Sun. I have a whole playlist of like criticizing those books if you want to check that out, but I did read 5 books from her. In 2020, I read 6 books by Courtney Milan, and this also should come as no surprise because I keep raving about her and have really fallen in love with her stuff. I read 6 books from her this year. She has been wonderful. I love her historical romances. And then my number 1 most read author, and where a lot of those New Zealand titles that you saw were coming from, is Nalini Singh. I read 10 books by Nalini Singh in 2020. All of those are in the Psy Changeling series, which I'm continuing to read this year too, so she's probably going to continue being one of my most read authors into 2021, but I have just been really loving that series and I've read a number of books from her. One thing that I will point out that I think is kind of interesting is looking at my top 6 most read authors, so the authors that I read 4 or more books from this year, only one of them is white, and that's Stephanie Meyer. So like, I don't know, that's interesting. So what were some of the big takeaways from this? Number 1 is I want to improve my diversity tracking for 2021. I want to get more granular about the things that I'm tracking so that I can tell you more statistically at the end of the year in 2021 about how I was doing reading books with disabled characters or authors, reading books about chronic illness, etc. So that's something that I am actively working on improving for my spreadsheet for next year. I also really want to increase the number of books by Indigenous authors and works in translation that I'm reading going into this year. Those were a couple of weak spots where I feel like things could definitely improve, as well as trying to read more books from non-US authors. That said, I also feel like I've really been leaning into what I like to read, and I think that's great. I'm also happy with how many indie titles I'm picking up. So overall, I feel like it was a really great reading year. A lot of things went really well, but I'm seeing some weak spots and places that I can improve moving into the rest of 2021. So if you have stuck with me through this entire thing, thank you. This was really interesting for me and something that I like to look at. These are things that I care about in my reading. Not everybody wants to look in this detailed way at the statistics of what they're doing, but for a variety of reasons, as somebody with a platform where I'm talking about books and sharing books, I want to be intentional about what I'm reading and why I'm reading it and how those choices are being made. So looking at my statistics is part of how I do that. This is going to be a very long video. I can already tell I've been talking for like an hour. Like the raw footage is going to be like an hour long, but it's fine. Talk to me in the comments down below. Let me know any of your thoughts or feelings on anything I talked about in this video. And for your question of the day, tell me about what you like to track in your reading. Do you like a more minimal approach where you just know maybe like the book you read and the rating? Or do you like to have really in-depth spreadsheets where you're tracking a whole bunch of information? One thing that I'm also going to attempt to do in 2021, so far so good, we'll see if I can keep up with it, is I'm going to try to track acquired books, where they come from, what I paid for them, if they were free, and where I buy them from, so that I can like actually know how much money I'm spending on books and like do a better job of being aware of that. So that's kind of like the new the new stats project for next year. But I'm looking forward to seeing how that goes. Talk to me in the comments down below. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more, and if you want to support the work of the channel, check out the Patreon linked down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.